Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think if we're trying to keep up with the time schedule, then we should get going. Just partly by way of introduction, the first time I spoke on the subject of my book, which is called Super Parents, Super Children, was in 1984 at one of the very first world conferences, ISIL conferences. I think this may be the second or the third one. So a lot of water has passed under the bridge since then. My children have grown up. So I will be able to give you some idea of whether the methods I outlined worked or not. At that time, they were still very small. In fact, I think one of them was about a year old. What's also interesting is that since that time, matters have not improved with respect to the freedom of children, the freedom and the responsibilities they have to take. It was bad already because the assumption has always been, I think throughout history, that adults know everything and children know nothing, and therefore obviously they should be told what to do, how to do it, and when to do it by their parents. I don't think the attitudes to children have changed immensely and are very different in different cultures, but there are few that don't assume the parents have all the information, the children have none, and plus the parents are bigger and stronger, and so they should call the shots. Now that has, as I said, got worse since I gave that talk, since I wrote the book 35 years ago. Especially, and in fact, almost entirely in the weird section of the world. That is the Western industrialized, educated, rich, and democratic societies. It does not apply in the same way at all to third world countries, developing countries. But in Western rich countries, things have got worse for children than they were previously. When I met Leon, my husband, who you saw on the earlier panel, he introduced me to the ideas of libertarianism, and I had a little girl at the time, and he said we should be able to raise our kids according to these principles. And I was a bit taken aback. I thought, no, I don't think that's going to work. But he persuaded me to give it a try, and there was really no literature on the subject to speak of, so we had to develop our own ideas and our own methods, which ended up being put into my book. We started by taking an underlying principle, which you all, I'm sure, agree with and are familiar with, which is that provided he does not harm other people or their property, every person should be free to act as he chooses. And then we tried to work out how we could make that happen with our children. We had a look around us and we saw that in general society, in most cases, at that time, not so true anymore, the parents had all the rights and the children had none. And that was the authoritarian model. In some cases, increasingly so now, in the weird societies, the children had the rights. And the parents didn't have very many. And that we called the permissive model. And then, unfortunately, more often than either of those being consistent, would be a sort of muddledy mix of both. Sometimes the parents would be completely authoritarian, but every now and then would give up when things got too difficult. In other cases, the permissive parents would lose their temper and lay down the law when they couldn't stand their kids just riding roughshod over them anymore. And so you'd have a completely arbitrary situation, which in some ways is worse than having the extremes. Because when kids never know what's going to happen, they can't measure they just become confused. They have no guidelines, on which to work. So we ended up deciding that what would be the ideal would be that both the parents would have the rights that we all believe in, the freedom to act as you choose, and the ownership of your property, and the children as well. And if we could have a situation where both were honoured, it would work much better for the children in terms of their upbringing. So in the process of trying to put this into action, we decided that the only important differences between children and adults was experience and the knowledge that comes with experience. So we said you can look at things like, well, children are smaller, they're weaker, they maybe need more sleep, they have some different dietary needs, but generally speaking, they're human beings who are growing, and there's the real and important difference is that we have experience and they don't. So we developed what we called the adult test to decide how we would interact with our kids. We would say to ourselves, what would I do in any given situation if this was an adult and not a child? And to that end, we said, what if somebody were to visit you and come and stay in your home from a completely different culture, who knew nothing about the rules of your world and your society? Maybe from another planet, or just simply from a different culture in another part of the world. And we decided that the way you would treat them is you would be respectful and you would teach them, for example, that glass breaks, that fluids spill, that hot things burn. But you would do that in a respectful and informative way. So that was the way that we proceeded with our kids. Really, in essence, children learn, all people learn by example, and that might be the example of their peers or their parents, and they learn by experience, what they experience in their lives. So if you don't respect their rights, or if you don't require that your own property rights are respected, they get that example, which is a bad example, which they follow. On the other hand, if you are respectful of them, and you teach them to be respectful of you, they learn both by example and experience to behave in a better way. Now, we all know that many parents give their children a very poor example on numerous fronts. They have bad temper control, they tell them what they must do with their toys, how they must treat them, they have no respect for their property rights, and so it goes. Also with the exercise of your own freedom, any child grows in confidence as they learn to take control of their own lives. And in fact, we know, don't we, that if you have these terrible tantrums with the 2-year-olds and so on, it's usually when you're trying to make them do something they don't want to, and their own will and their desire to control their own environment comes up against your desire to control them, and then you have a clash of wills. But if right from that early age onwards, you explain and respect, if necessary, pick them up and move them if it's a matter of danger, you will find that we actually, I must say, in the course of raising our children, we enjoyed them really very much and had none of the problems that our friends were having with their kids. And that was why I wrote the book, because they said to us, what are you doing? Why are your children so nice? So nice to have around. They're respectful, they behave well, they keep themselves amused, they don't make demands, and they're just really nice kids. But I wasn't sure, of course, how they would be in the end, which I will tell you later. Now, we allowed our kids to eat what they wanted, to choose their own food, to go to sleep when they wanted, to do their homework or not. What we didn't do was protect them from the consequences. So if they didn't do their homework, we didn't send a letter to the school teacher giving them an excuse. They had to explain themselves. My oldest daughter got a new party dress, and it was the middle of winter and she wanted to wear it to school. And I said, you know, you're going to be very cold. And no, she was determined, so off she went. When she came home later that day, I said, how was your day? She said, I was very cold. So, it's a simple principle. We let them learn by experience the consequence. There are, however, a couple of things I just want to mention, because complete freedom obviously can raise problems around, for example, sugar addiction. There's so much sugar in our society, and sugar is very addictive for any of you who are into diet and know about it. So in our home, we just did not have that available to our kids. We didn't eat it, and it wasn't available to them. They went out to parties with friends, then they ate it. And as adults now, none of them are sugar addicts, I'm pleased to say. Also, the issue of computer games, I think, is a new problem that our children didn't have. But the research, and I'll go on to that in a little while, indicates that if children are free to go outside and play with their friends, they prefer that to playing a computer game or watching TV. So the fear of addiction to computers is probably exaggerated. Also, we worked completely around property rights issues. So until our kids were older, they didn't have their own, they never had their own television sets. So the TV was ours, and we would say, no, this is my television, and I decide, I control it. So if you want to watch, let's choose your own programs, we'll record them for you, and we can set aside time for that. So if it's your property, you have the right to control it, and I understood that. Now, I know everybody seems to buy their little babies iPads and things these days, but I think that's ill-advised. I think one should wait until they're a little older before putting them, and then have other options for them that will compete with that. I just want to move on a bit now to the whole issue of why more people aren't libertarians, why more people don't value freedom in the way that we do around the world. And I personally am of the view that it has a lot to do with the way in which we've evolved as humans. And I'm just putting this up here in case any of you are interested in reading this book. This man, Edward Wilson, is a biologist and philosopher. And he maintains very convincingly in his book that the reason humans dominate the world today is because we are a combination of bees and monkeys. We, like monkeys, in our hierarchical behavior, fighting for territory, submissiveness to the bigger monkey, that whole group type of thing. And we like bees in that we're also highly cooperative and very altruistic in many, many ways. And we'll cooperate, for example, in war. We'll also cooperate, as we see, in helping people in disaster, and so on. And this whole polarization in most of our religions and so on around good and bad seems to have its roots in these evolutionary tendencies that have developed within us. Now, if a major tendency is submission to authority, when you bully your children or order them around or tell them what to do, they grow up feeling that they should submit to authority. Some of them become very rebellious. Most of them repeat the pattern later with their own kids. Some of them have all of their vitality taken out of them. But it certainly doesn't teach them the value of freedom and responsibility. So my view is that if we hope to have more of these kind of people in the world, more of the people that value what we value, and which would improve pretty much everything if that were the case, then we must hope that the kind of methods I've been talking become more popular. There's a new book out recently. How's my time going? Does anybody know? What time do I have to finish? What does it say on there? There's a new book out by a man called David Lancy called The Anthropology of Childhood, and he compares children in different cultures all around the world. And he points out that in the weird societies, the babies are like cherubs, like perfect little angels, the ones I mentioned to you earlier, the Westernized, etc. And he says, he observes that they're protected from everything. They lose their freedom in the process. It's a peculiar combination of them being the center of their parents' lives. Their parents' lives revolve around trying to do everything and get everything done for them, and and at the same time giving them really no freedom at all. And he observes that in the developing countries, it's not like that at all. In fact, in many countries, children are regarded as a unit of labor for the family. And when they're born, that is their purpose, to add to the labor value of the family, not to be a little cherub. So when you, in fact, look around you in Bali, you will see that the kids are very involved in the life of the family. They're putting out things in the temple, the offerings. They're helping with the cleaning. They're doing a bit of sweeping. They're in the garden. They're helping prepare the food. They're assumed to be a functional, helpful unit of the family. Whereas in the weird societies, everything is done for them. They do nothing for themselves. They're not expected to do anything for themselves. And I'm sure many of you observed that some of them never grow up these days. They're 40-year-olds, still single and at home with their parents because they can't afford the rent. And that is commonplace. The freedom is so curtailed in the UK and the USA, and I don't know, to some extent certainly in Australia and South Africa, and apparently in China it's becoming more this way as well. The children are only allowed to play indoors where it's safe. They have no work or chores. They get very little exercise, and they're fed junk food because that's what they want, and they get whatever they want. They can't be unhappy, so the use of antidepressants in children has tripled since 1993. I'm sure you've all seen that. Kids now, half of them are on some kind of drug, ADHD or something for ADHD or for depression or whatever. And they're not allowed to be frightened, so they're not allowed to go out on Halloween and see scary things. They have no work and no chores, and they have too much praise. Everything they do is wonderful. And even if it's not at all wonderful, they're told it's wonderful. So this reduces motivation and persistence. And what they found is children have become self-centered, unhelpful, dependent well into adulthood. In China, for those of you who know that culture, the little emperor syndrome is what's causing the problems there. And apparently the children are now less competitive, more pessimistic and less conscientious than they used to be. These things are not true, by the way, for Sweden. Sweden has somehow escaped it, and Thailand and Japan. Apparently in those countries they don't have this effect of this cotton wool around the kids which take away their freedom, give them everything they want except for freedom and responsibility. Now in North America, there's a woman called Leonore Skenazy, so it's no longer just me anymore. And I've kind of disappeared off the scene for a long time. She is a journalist, and she wrote a column in which she explained that she had let her 9-year-old go on his own on the subway in New York City. And there was an outcry. Some people wanted her convicted of child abuse. And she then was known as America's worst mum, or the world's worst mum. And she wrote a book called Free Range Kids. And she's now doing a lot of work in this area, which I think is absolutely great. She's got an app, for those of you who are interested. She's obviously got a website and a blog. And she gives all the facts and figures that people need to make them less fearful. She's got a program on discovery. She goes into people's homes, and she works with parents who will be feeding a 10-year-old by hand. Or will only let their child ride their bike on grass, or won't let them use a knife to cut because they might cut themselves. I mean, this is what is happening. And I have a friend in New York City who actually referred me to the anthropology book, who has I've seen her with her friends and their kids. They are terrified of letting those children out of their sight. Even if they play, the mums are watching, frightened that something might happen. She gives all the facts. You know, one of the very great fears that people have is that the child is going to be abducted. And I don't know if that's true in your countries, but it's very strong in the United States and the UK. It's pretty strong in South Africa. She points out, as do others, that only 3%, well, first of all, the child molestation and murder has declined since 1976 to now. So it's less likely to happen now than it was when I was a young woman. That only 3% of abductions are by strangers. 70% are by family members, and the rest by family friends. She says to parents, what do you think is more likely, that your child will be abducted or that he'll have a heart attack? And they say abduction, but a heart attack is much more likely. And you know how unlikely a heart attack is. So she tries to help people get over their fears. I thought a little bit about why people are so fearful. Oh, I don't know what's happened to my other slide. Oh. And I thought that I too have been a victim of that fear. I felt it. Even my kids are grown up, so it's not relevant to me. But I thought if I had children, I would. And I think the reason is because we're attracted to bad news, we know that. And with the social media and international television, a child gets abducted somewhere in the UK or America, and the whole world is bombarded with a story. Not just then, but for years subsequently. It's what Kahneman talks about in Thinking Fast and Slow. Absolutely wonderful book. If any of you are interested in learning about how your brain works and how the unconscious mind dominates really everything that we do. And we're completely delusional about our sense of control over our lives. He says that when something is repeated, our brain doesn't distinguish between truth and familiarity. If we've heard something often, if it comes quickly to mind, our brain thinks it's true. Our conscious mind thinks it's true. If you remember something easily, you believe and think it's important. So the media feeding frenzy, and I think the same thing applies to what they were talking about in the earlier session about global warming and HIV/AIDS and the violence in the Middle East at the moment. That there's this feeding frenzy on the media, and those images go into your unconscious mind because that's where we perceive it. And you believe something's true if everybody says so. So everybody says there's global warming. Everywhere you hear it. I mean, I'm totally confused on the subject at this point, and I simply don't know. But I've heard many people say it's happening, and many people say it isn't. And I don't know enough to read the science properly for myself. Peter Gray, he has written a book called Free to Learn, and he points out that if children don't play, they don't learn. And if you look at every mammal you can think of, the babies play. That's how they learn. We see that in every animal. And they imitate the parents. And let's think about monkeys, because they're the closest to us. They play wildly when they're little. They run away from their mothers and back again. They imitate what the parents are doing and learn from them, and that's how they grow. Now, in the weird societies, the children aren't allowed to play anymore. In the schools, they're not allowed to have a break time. And if they do, the teacher watches in case somebody gets bullied. When I was young, if you got bullied, your parents said to you, they taught you how to stand up for yourself, or if you were really incapable of doing that for some reason, they would say report it to somebody in authority. But now nobody's allowed to be exposed to bullying. They're not allowed to take any kind of responsibility for themselves. And he says his definition of free play is freely chosen and directed by the participant, undertaken for its own sake, especially out of doors. You see it here in Bali, and we live in Africa, and we're building a house in a little village. And our house is surrounded by some African small holdings. And I see those kids playing freely. They first, when they get home from school, they go out maybe and they get the cattle in, or the goats, or they feed the chickens, or they do tasks around the house and they work with the family, and then they play. And they run around freely, and I have no idea where their parents are, and they're certainly not sitting watching them. So and I see here as well, in Bali, that the children play. So this is really a first world problem, but it's a very serious problem. Over the past 60 years, anxiety, depression, suicide, helplessness and narcissism have increased dramatically in the weird societies. Suicide for under 15s has quadrupled, and from 15 to 24 it's doubled. And suicide correlates to a lack of control, a sense of control. They feel they have no control over their lives, and they feel helpless. And that causes anxiety and depression. He cites some studies that were done asking students to rate different things they would like for the future. In 1967, 46% of students wanted to be well off monetarily. In 2006, 75% did. The desire to develop a meaningful philosophy of life, 86% valued in 1967 and only 42% in 2006. So the emphasis has moved away from internal growth to getting as much wealth as possible. And it's moved away from actually just letting the kids be and learn in the process of growing up to controlling every action that they take in the hopes that they're going to get into an Ivy League college or whatever the story is. Well, as you get older, most of you are very young in this room, you realize that meaning in life is all that matters. It is meaning that makes life worth living and that gives you happiness. You've heard it often, I'm sure, that it's not money. It is not money. It's a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning that does that for you. And a lot of that meaning comes from individuation, from becoming a complete person on your own who meets your own needs, doesn't require that others do that for you, like your kids, and who allows other people to follow their own path, including your children. Now, just to get to the subject of my children, before I end, I told you I'd speak to them about it. My two girls, I've got three daughters. The one said she has always felt ahead of her peers from an open-minded perspective as a result of her upbringing. My close friends now had similar parents who taught their children to take responsibility for their actions. That's what the one said. The other one said, I'm an independent spirit and a free thinker. I have a strong sense of self-respect and I feel able. Well, that was what I hoped for, really. And the title I had up here in the beginning, Raising Libertarian Children, is inaccurate. It's Raising Free Children. And I think of that as free to think for themselves, to take their own decisions and take responsibility, and not to expect others to, and to respect others' equal freedom. Now, I haven't mentioned my third daughter because she was the one who challenged us most greatly in this respect. Because when she was about 22, she developed schizophrenia. And she's now quite severely ill. She's 36 now. For a while, she was willing to see doctors, and then before she was even, around about the time she was diagnosed, when she was about 27, she said to me, I'm not seeing any more psychiatrists or psychologists. And she was the kind of person, probably because of the way we brought her up, when she made up her mind, she made up her mind, and that was it. She put her foot down, and she was stubborn. So we, in the end, had a choice. Did we use physical force against her and take her to a mental hospital and force her to take medication? Or did we leave that in her own hands? And it was a very difficult choice because huge pressure was put on us to take her by force, or to have somebody, they to come around, they said the child's a danger to themselves, and they come around and they ship them off to the mental home. And then, of course, they medicate them against their wishes. So I went through a lot of soul searching. I did a great deal of reading. My gut feeling was very against using force against her. She was adamant, and at the time when she still communicated with us, which she doesn't anymore, she used to say, you brought me up to be free. Now why are you interfering with me? This is my decision. I'm not going to take the medication. You don't want me to take drugs. Why do you want me to take these drugs? When she still communicated. Anyway, in the end, we left her free. And after doing all the reading I did, I decided that anyway the medication would not help her particular type of schizophrenia. I might have taken different measures if I'd thought so. It's hard to say. But she has what's called deficit schizophrenia, which means she turns into herself and loses contact with the world. She ceases to be interested in the outside world. Her world is in her head. And that deficit schizophrenia, they haven't found medication for that. And, if you read extensively, it doesn't stop them from saying, well, your daughter should be medicated. They could stop her delusions, that is the world in her head, but they could not take away her internalized behavior. So then she would be an internalized person with no life in her head. She would be like an empty shell. So we have left her alone. Now, over that time, she's become more and more withdrawn. At one stage, she became so thin, I thought she might die. And I went to see various doctors, and we decided if she collapsed, we would take her to the hospital. That would be the time we would intervene physically, if she collapsed. And I set up the process whereby she would be taken in and had letters written to protect us from being accused of child abuse, saying that we'd seen the psychiatrists and so on. It never came to that, thank goodness. She now lives with us. She did live alone for a long time, but the people in the area around her couldn't handle seeing her on the streets. It was too upsetting for them. She wears rags. She doesn't comb her hair. And she looks like a street person. And she was at that point so thin, she looked like she'd come out of balsam. So I understood that they couldn't cope with it. We tried a couple of options, but she ended up living with us. And she now lives in our flat, and she lives in an armchair in my lounge. It's a big armchair, and that's her home. She sleeps there. She sits there in the day. She goes out and buys food. She won't eat anything anybody else gives her. The only interaction with me is she'll ask me for money now and then. So she goes to the shops, and I think in the area she is now, they know that she's with her mother and father, and her two sisters live in the area. So when people say, who is this person? Why isn't anybody looking after her? Because at one point it went on Facebook, everybody was saying, who's this child? Get hold of her parents. Why is she out on the streets like this? Yeah, so this has been a great challenge to our views on how you should raise your children and respect other human beings. And in the end, I work now with people in hospice who are dying. And what I've seen is the terrible things that happen in families, because when people are dying, they tell you everything. And you hear the dreadful relationships within families, and they're all around the desire of one family member to get something from the other. They expect something from them. Their need is based on what that person can fulfill, and that works both ways. So they end up with rage and hatred because they're not letting each other live their own lives and be separate. And with Millie, we've had to do that in the extreme because she's not in our world anymore. She might as well have been a nun who went into a convent and in a silent order. We have no idea what goes on. We see that she weeps. We see that she laughs. We see her looking concerned. Sometimes if we do something, she gets very angry if we interfere or change something in her environment. But she's in her world. And the man who trains us at hospice, he said to me, and I'm going to end with this, he said to me, you have to honor her journey. And that is true for each and every one of us. Honor the journey of the people around you. Honor the journeys of your children, your friends, the different cultures. If we could all just learn to take care of ourselves and work for our own growth and meaning in life and honor everybody else's right to do the same, I think the world would be a much better place.
Have about 8 minutes chance for questions. Anybody have questions?
Yeah, from what age on do you
Okay.
sorry.
Nick?
I'm Nick from Canberra, Australia. So I guess my question is, from what age do you reckon we should let the kids start to experience or feel the consequence of the choice they made, and then say, thank you.
Okay, so what we found is that children don't try to make decisions they're not ready to make, first of all. I mean, your baby, it's actually quite young, they start hitting away that food and wanting that food, but we just would allow them to make decisions as they reach the point they wanted to. And we baby-proofed the house. We did not leave our beautiful china lying where the baby could knock it over, and things like that. We baby-proofed the house. We made sure that it was like a free zone for them. The cupboards that were open when they were crawling, they could pull the things out and play with. They weren't going to break them. So we didn't have to be saying no, no, no all the time. And once they indicated that they wanted to wear this and not that, then we let them make that choice.
No, I had exactly the same question.
I'm interested in, I suppose, the concept of a libertarian childhood I grew up with.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your views of the concept of a libertarian childhood that I grew up with, which was basically my parents' view that you should learn to live in the law of the jungle, that you shouldn't feed preconceptions, and that as a girl with two brothers, you're at a slight disadvantage physically, but then you have to learn to manipulate them to get what you want. So how do you think, aside from the relationship with you, how do you think you should have children approach their world and their interaction with others?
Well, we had those basic rules that I mentioned to you, that they should respect other people's property rights and other people's freedom of choice. And those were really the only rules. So if one of them wanted to grab a toy from the other and the other was unable to defend their own property, we might have intervened and said, you know, that's not your toy, that's his toy. And then if they didn't want to share, we'd say, that's fine, it's yours. You don't have to share if you don't want to. But then other people probably won't want to share with you. So we did give them a structure. It wasn't just the law of the jungle. We respected their rights. They could make whatever mess they wanted in their bedrooms and not tidy up. But, you know, in South Africa, we have domestic service. We would say to the maid, don't tidy the room. It's their responsibility to look after that. We had very little sibling problems, to tell you the truth, almost none. And I think it's because I had the girls 4 years apart, and that was quite deliberate. So I was able to get the one to the point where she was going to the Montessori nursery school and had her own life and friends before the next one came along. So the sibling issues hardly arose. If problems arose, they might be between us and the kids. We might have friends around and we'd say, no, we've got our friends here now. You need to be quiet and respect us. So I think the approach was perhaps a little different.
My question is, like, let's say if a 7-year-old wants to try and smoke a cigarette, and like, what do you do then? Because you said the example of your daughter wearing this dress and experiencing the cold, but would you allow the 7-year-old to try and smoke, then realize that it's not good for the throat or something?
Definitely. They would hate it. It would make them feel terrible. Probably put them off for life. I definitely wouldn't stop them from having a drag at a cigarette. But we wouldn't be smoking in the home, so we tried to be an example of what we were telling them not to do. We didn't say don't eat sweets and then sit and eat a box of chocolates, you know. We tried to be consistent.
I smoke, therefore I am asking this
So
question.
it's, yes, but she would hate it. It would probably make her ill.
Kids probably hate it, yeah.
Yes.
So my wife is a Montessori teacher, and I agree with a lot of what you said. And I think as far as kids, if kids want to learn something, they should be free to explore that. Okay, I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but I think some libertarian parents just want to be a friend to their child, and the child can do whatever they want, and the parent is just there to help them. I kind of feel that as a parent, I'm not a friend, I'm a parent. And so my daughter is only 2, but she has a schedule that we follow. And if I think that she cannot have something, I will say you cannot have it, and she can cry, but I will not give in. I'm not sure exactly what I want to ask you, but what is your feeling about, is a parent just a friend? Or does being a parent mean something different? I mean, aside from obligations, in terms of discipline, does that make sense?
Yes, I don't think a parent is just a friend at all. I think that's that permissive attitude, or that modern attitude, that's giving such a lot of trouble in the US, where the kids are not just friends, but they're the most important person in the room. So I see my American friends, if they're having a conversation with a girlfriend and the child comes up and interrupts, they stop. And speak to the child. And I think, would you do that if it was an adult from another culture in your home? No, you wouldn't. You'd say, in our culture, we don't interrupt. We wait till the people have stopped speaking, and then we ask our question. So, no, I don't think you're just a friend, and you have a huge amount of experience and knowledge that they don't have. And I think your job is to encourage them to grow and develop and take responsibility and do things for themselves, and to help them in the process. However, I wouldn't say, no, you can't do that. We didn't do that with our kids. If it was a 2-year-old and we made sure that the plugs were safety proofed, for example, so we didn't need to say no. We made sure that they were in an environment. Had one of them started wandering into the street, we'd have grabbed them and pulled them back. But as far as we're concerned, that's the adult test. If you had an old mother who was half blind and she started wandering, you'd also grab her and put her back. Somebody who's deaf or whatever. So, however, if you've decided you're going to have certain rules and regulations in the home, and you're going to require certain types of behavior, then I think the important thing is consistency. I think if the children feel loved and they feel secure and they know what's going on and safe, that approach, especially if you're a Montessori teacher, you're certainly allowing them to be self-directed. I don't think that's a serious issue at all. It's the inconsistency that's the problem. You see the parents, no, and then when the child's whined for the 8th time, they give them what they want. That I think is a problem.
Sorry, we ran out of the time, but I hope Francis will entertain your question in the private setting, social setting. Thank you very much. But I just have a small testimony. Before we had our daughter, you met her, Ken and I read Francis' book, because we are determined to learn how to raise a libertarian child. So now the product is here. I'm not joking. One thing is so important to us, because we decided that we don't want our child to drink soda, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, whatever. So we made the decision we don't have that at home. We don't drink it. So we didn't have it, never had it. So she never learned to drink that. For smoking, it's the same issue, I guess. And by the way, we didn't childproof our house, but she didn't break anything, because I didn't think the child will intentionally sabotage anything more than any adult would do. I broke more chinas than my daughter did. So anyways, I highly recommend her book. We learned so much from it, and that's why I insist to invite her here. Thank you.
There are copies available for 100,000 rupees each.